Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you're tuning in from. Welcome to INE Live Special Report Edition. My name is Jack Reedy, and I am here to host. This segment is dedicated to the events of the world and discussing the impacts as they might have on business and technology. As always, we're answering your questions as well in the chat. Before we get started, as we do each time we stream on INE Live, I want to let you know we are streaming live across many different social media platforms right now, including Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and Twitch. Unfortunately, LinkedIn's having a little issues, but we'll get on it soon. Be sure to like, follow, and subscribe with notifications turned on for whichever platform you're using, so that way you can stay in the loop whenever we go live to hear the most relevant news, training, or interviews on technology for absolutely free to you. Now, as I said before, we do definitely want to get you involved in the conversation. Talk to us, talk to others. We absolutely love to see it. So our team is monitoring the chat, and if you have any comment, drop it in. And if you have a question, just throw a Q in front of it at the beginning. We can find them easily, and they will send them over my way. We will definitely try to get to as absolutely many as we can today. As I said previously, my name is Jack Reedy, Sec IT guy across all of the social platforms, and I am the Director of Cybersecurity Content here at INE. I'll be your host as we discuss the ongoing Ukraine-Russia conflict, the cybersecurity implications, and actions you can take. I swear I can talk good. With that, I'll bring in my co-host for today, INE's Chief Content Officer, Neal Bridges. Hey, Neal, thank you so much for being here.
How's it going, Jack? Glad to be sharing the stage with you again today. Looking forward to this chat today.
Absolutely. Now, I know we each have a little bit of prior experience engaging with foreign operations, and while we definitely can't talk into the details, can you describe a bit of your previous work for the audience so they understand where we're coming from?
Yeah, absolutely. So I spent time in the Air Force from 2003 to 2013. The majority of that was doing cyber work in some way, shape, or form. Round about the 2008 time period, I got really, really involved with U.S. Cyber Command. And specifically working to focus specifically on building out capabilities for the National Security Agency, for a lot of other Air Force units that were kind of focused in on the offensive side of operations, specifically for the United States Air Force. Most people may not be aware of this, but the reason that distinction is made is because in a wartime scenario, civilians and contractors can't conduct actual wartime operations on behalf of the United States. It has to be a somebody who actually is a Department of Defense, enlisted or officer member. And so those types of wartime cybersecurity activities were conducted by a lot of us there in the military. And so NSA as well as CIA and some other organizations make heavy use of what we've heard as blue suitors, or in your case, the Mar4 Cyber or R Cyber or any of the other cyber organizations that are out there. And so we were the Air Force's arm. We worked with two primary organizations. One focused on network warfare operations, and the other one focused on telephone warfare operations, if you will. And then so I was involved in both units at one point in time doing both of those opportunities. But happy to talk in depth as far as what was happening in the region then at that time, tactics and techniques, procedures, how we viewed the issues that were unfolding in the region at the time, and really just kind of shed some light on this construct of cyber war that really seems to have everybody up in a tizzy right now.
Absolutely. And similarly, but from a different perspective, obviously, we've talked about it previously, but I was involved in the Marine Corps from 2009 to 2018. And about 2014, I got involved with Mar4 Cyber, which is a subsidiary of U.S. Cyber Command. The difference for me was I was specifically focused on intrusion detection for, what do they call it? Defensive and counter infiltration operations. A whole bunch of acronyms to basically say I did threat hunting all over the world.
And I realize that we may get, like, you're talking to like a bunch of like two military folks here. I promise you we're going to try not to get too far into the military acronym stuff today. But I think the real important part is that when you use the word, and I don't want to take too much out of your speech that you got there, Jack, but when we talk about cyber war, oftentimes it is in the construct of military. And so I felt like Jack and I would be a great opportunity to come in and share with you what it was like to actually be in the military during a time where they were trying to define what cyber war was. We were actively engaged in some form of cyber warfare, either on the receiving end or the delivery end of it, even though it wasn't highly talked about at the time.
Well, yeah, and I mean, I think that it's not even really that highly talked about today. Even I don't think a lot of people even realize how much of the face of warfare has changed just because of the cyber domain and the ubiquity of technical devices on a day-to-day basis, and then people that are experts at attacking those or defending them. Either way,
Yeah,
you know,
100%.
I mean, and with that too, I mean, what we can just start at the basics here. What would you define cyber warfare as?
Well, I love how you make that distinction, because I think that there's really kind of two ways that we talk about this topic, right? There is cyber warfare, and then there is the definition of cyber war.
Mhm.
And I like making those two distinctions, because if we look at traditional kinetic warfare, if I drop a bomb in a location, you can see it, it explodes. You know that something bad has happened. And in the construct of a cyber war, we have not defined what cyber war actually looks like. As a matter of fact, it's been a huge point of contention, even when I was in, versus even the 2011 doctrine that was put out, and that was the closest that I think the United States has ever come, where they've said that the U.S. reserves the right to respond to any cyber attack using kinetic based warfare. But even the United States has not defined what a cyber war looks like. And I think that that just adds to the ambiguity that comes with any type of cyber warfare we may see. And so I'll flip it back over to you for the cyber warfare definition.
So, cyber warfare specifically, I would say, is the cyber attacks levied in the interest of a nation state. So it would be more so specifically, or associated entities, I should say. Generally, though, you make a really great point. It's not very clearly defined. At which point is the basics of intelligence collection versus attack doctrine? Is it just when it turns kinetic? Is it because you shut off the power? Like, which part of it?
So, and this was something that we were taught very extensively in the Air Force, is that it really depends on your intent.
Hmm.
There's a lot of we could get really deep, and I apologize for the audience. The hesitation is trying to figure out like how deep we go with this, because you're literally talking about trying to dissect tens of years of military doctrine between Jack and myself. But there's really kind of two legal constructs that determine intent. It's Title 10 and Title 50. And Title 10 is really that warfare aspect of it, where you actually go and you cause some type of effect against a target. And then you have Title 50, which is really geared towards the intelligence collection of it. And honestly, the way that the agency, the way that the military, the way that a lot of the government looks at it, is all boils down to intent. What is your intent?
Yeah, fully. And so we're saying that to go ahead and say that when you hear the word cyber warfare or cyber war, right, utilized in media and groups like that, please know that this is a very murky, even with professionals, this is a very murky type of area. But I think what we're going to be focusing in on is what is the intent, especially as it relates to Ukraine and Russia today, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but with that, we both have a bit of experience as far as what does the day-to-day type of cyber warfare, wherever you're doing with the levying of attacks, what would the attackers in this case or the defenders really look like as far as a day-to-day type of uh unit go by, if you will?
Oh, I'd say you couldn't tell the difference. You couldn't tell
Mhm.
the difference. I think that that's what continues to add to the ambiguity, is that um, the distinction between cyber criminal activity and the distinction between state sponsored activity is really only levied based on that intent, or maybe to a very lesser degree some of the TTPs that are used. And I know that we'll get into some of the TTPs a little bit later on that you talk about. But I think that that's what makes it so difficult, and that's what's made classifying cyber war versus cyber criminal activity so difficult and so challenging.
I would agree. I would say that one very specific. grouping that I have noticed when it comes to high-end state-sponsored groups is the advancedness of it. You know what I mean? The access to things, the maturity of the TTPs, if you will. Generally
The,
speaking, they know what they're doing.
I want to kind of dive into that maturity of the TTPs. When we talk about TTPs or tactics, techniques, and procedures, when we talk about the maturity, I want to unpack that one a little bit, Jack, and let's
Mhm.
let's walk the audience through kind of what we talk about when we talk about the maturity of those. When you look at some of the hacktivism that's going on right now with Anonymous or Ukraine calling on a malicious cyber warfare force to help them in their struggles, there is no discipline to that motive or to that initiative. It is pray and spray. It is go out there and hack whatever it is that you can hack and do whatever it is that you can do. And what I would almost say is that when Jack talks about the maturity of those TTPs, I think that that's how we would scale up if you were to look at the definition of state-sponsored activity is they have a very, very mature operation to the tactics, techniques, and procedures that they're using in the sense that they have what we refer to in the military as strategy to task. They have a strategy which is defined at their most upper levels of their military forces. And in the United States of America, it'd be like the Joint Chiefs of Staff, right? That's given down by the presidential directives. And then they would take that strategy and they would develop operational and tactical level tasks with which to achieve said strategy. And they'd have, KPIs and metrics and things like that, battle damage assessments and things like that to kind of measure the success of those strategy to task operations. And I think, Jack, that's what you're referring to when you talk about the maturity, right? Is how do you go from
Correct.
just spraying and praying to having a real strategy to task in your military doctrine?
Yeah, I'm definitely not just talking about being good at the job, right? Definitely talking about the holistic view of what the organization is. And what I don't think a lot of people realize is that when these attacks happen, it's not like happenstance. They got into the government, and this group was just they had a big vulnerability, and that's why they got in. And it was an attack of opportunity, and that's not the case at all. Usually, it's
Yeah.
very strategic. It's planned out. They might do some surface retention type of evaluations as to what's the likelihood of landing on these machines versus others and go for the softer targets. But still, access is
And I
access. Right?
and I think that when we get to kind of like the first point about like what enterprises should be looking at when they're trying to decide like should you be worried about getting attacked as part of this ongoing conflict that we're seeing or some of these cyber attacks, I think you have to look internally about yourself and say what potential advantage could I have as an organization, either because of access to my clients, either because of access to my customers, either because of access to the networks that if you're an MSP, maybe you protect other networks and things like that. And so I think you have to self reflect on yourself and say,
Mhm.
what is my core business model? And would an adversary benefit from having access to my networks? And I think that if you can answer that simple question yourself, you probably have grown up on that radar chart about you potentially could be a target of some nation state type of attack.
Mhm. Absolutely, absolutely. Real quick question from DS over here. Does the US use the term cyber warfare as a catch-all for anything that might happen in the virtual world? I would I would argue that it is more so a catch-all for a tool set or a domain of operations as opposed to, just in case of anything happening. It's the same as saying like ground, sea, air, space
Hmm.
to them. It's not necessarily like a reflective of these events happened and this is cyber warfare, but this isn't.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think I hate to use the word catch-all, but they've used cyberspace as a domain when Jack talks
Mhm.
about airspace, land, um, airspace, land. See, there we go. I forgot
Sea and
my
space
brethren. Yeah, I forgot my brethren in the Navy for that one.
and
Um,
Space Force.
Yeah, and those are domains, and so cyber warfare is warfare that is happening in the cyber domain. Um, but that's why we make the distinction between cyber warfare and the actual definition of a cyber war. For those who are not
Mhm.
familiar with the United States, before the president can authorize certain activities, there has to be a congressional agreement on whether something was indeed an act of war, and that affects things like funding, yada yada yada, tons of stuff. This is non-political. This is just how the congressional process works. And
Mhm.
so by having a very, very specific definition of cyber war or having a lack of a definition, if you will, of a cyber war, it makes it more ambiguous for those types of activities to occur.
Mhm. very much so, or get hung up in the process. Whereas,
Yeah.
I mean, can you imagine just trying to authorize absolutely everything constantly, day in and day out, over and over
Oh
and
yeah.
over again? So with that, let's talk a little bit about Russia.
Yeah.
Okay, like I said, we have some experience here, so let's talk a bit about historically Russian operations. Now, one of the things that I was taught is they generally have two operating classes when it comes to um, information technology, which is information technical and then information psychological. One being the actual engagement of technology and information, IT devices and things like that, versus information psychological, which is more of the fake news ingestion of media information that better moves their plot along, if you will. But I think we're going to focus more on the information technical here to talk about that stuff, because we can we can dive super deep and long into fake news all day, right? um,
Yeah, yeah, that's the and when we talk about that, just we talk about that in the sense of information warfare operations. That is
mhm,
an entire class of warfare operations that couldn't every country can do, and it goes very, very deep. Yeah.
mhm. There, yeah. So I mean, like we know it a lot from being deployed as psyops types of operations. Psychological operations is another name for it. But we're going to, like I said, we're going to pivot away from that and move into the information technology, information technical space from what their doctrine says. However, what I want to talk about though is the history. So, two primary APT groups. If you guys are unfamiliar with APT groups, they stand for Advanced Persistent Threats, that are
Little loose,
associated.
little loose on the advanced part. Just just to throw
Yeah,
that one out there.
true, true, true. But they are represented by the name 28 and 29, or the grouping number 2829, referenced heavily in MITRE ATT&CK framework. And yeah, you're correct. I mean, they run a gambit of things, and some are super advanced, some are not really, like, they're a little surprising by how sloppy they got. But realistically, I mean, they're aiming at government organizations, political targets, like the DNC has been known confirmed. um, Solar winds was another attack that was associated with them as well. I mean, that was massive, which that one was a bit more. And then also a couple financial sector stuff. So, it, you kind of pointed out this runs the gamut of stuff, both in technique and also targeting. So, where do you think the targeting is lying right now, as far as compared to historical operations and right now?
I think we've seen Russia, especially when you make the distinction between their information tactical side. They have traditionally targeted disruption of communications in the targets they have chosen to take any type of kinetic military action against, right? And so when we talk about that, um, um, we've seen this in Estonia, right? They had an incident in Estonia a number of years. I think 2008 was when they did the incident in Estonia. I think they've had a couple other incidents over the last few years. And when we talk about military doctrine, one of the things that we oftentimes focus on, whether it's a kinetic war, whether it's a psychological war, or even whether it's a war in cyberspace or something like that, is we have to target the ability for the adversary to communicate and make decisions. One of the key fundamental points that we make in the military, especially in the intelligence game, is how quickly can our leaders make a decision? That's what the value of intelligence is. And if anybody's heard me on my stream, you know that I oftentimes use this when I talk about the return on investment when you're talking to the board of directors, or to the CISO or the CFO or something like that, right? Is how quickly can you get information and get it to your leaders? And so when you look at what tactics Russia has employed, even with Russia and Ukraine, as well as what they've done with Estonia and other countries in the past, it's been primarily targeted on those parliamentary buildings, those Ministry of Defense organizations, the ability for those military leaders to communicate and make those decisions faster and get that information over to the respective party leaders. And so I think that's kind of point number one, is again getting back to, if you're in that chain, if you provide any type of support that allows communication between organizations that could potentially communicate, whether that's as something as simple as WhatsApp, Signal, Telegram, all the way up to some of the classified closed loop systems that exist in some organizations. You, as a telecom agency or as an internet provider agency, are probably one of the primary targets for this type of aggression, because you're going to be able to directly contribute or affect the ability of the target organization to make any type of military judgment.
Absolutely. What and with that too, I mean, we talk about the cutting off and, turning off the lights or things like that when it comes to the telecoms or communication aspects. But what about utilities? I know that they were targeted not very long ago. There was a massive concern in the US about them having actually been breached by Russia previously. I think that might be in this case. I look at it as economic impact. Anything
Mhm.
that can be targeted as far as either economic impact or, like you said, communications, telecoms would possibly be a current risk.
Utilities are rough, right? Because and when we talk about utilities, when I talk about them being rough, there's this concept of second and third order effects that come with utilities. If you look at any country, look at a power grid, for example, there probably isn't just one thing operating on the power grid. It's probably not just one base. Same with like a water treatment facility plan. It's probably not just one military installation that water treatment facility plan is there. And so you do have to take into consideration that there is the potential that you could have second and third order effects, meaning that if we shut off the power to a military installation, that shower to a hospital, and that right there has other human rights and Geneva Convention type of aspects to it. And so, some people may go like, well, nobody cares about Geneva Convention. What is that there for? And it's real important to understand that the Geneva Convention is there to allow us to have a global law system to actually prosecute war crimes should that ever get invoked. And so it is really important to be able to classify that if there was a cyber attack from Russia and Ukraine that shut off a power grid that sure was targeting a military installation, but also caused thousands and thousands of people to die in a hospital because of a second order effect. That goes to help the world enforcement, through the Geneva Convention, to say that you've actually conducted war crimes in this regard. And so, I think that's when we talk about those larger order utility based effects, we have to take into effect the collateral damage that could come with shutting down a power grid, poisoning a water treatment facility plant, disrupting a nuclear power plant where you could potentially have a nuclear waste disaster. And so, while I do think that they are primary targets in a lot of cases when we talk about cyber warfare, and so if you're listening to this and you are doing cybersecurity for any type of any type of utility company, you are definitively a target. Understand that there's also the consideration about what could potentially happen through the disruption of you as a target set as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, we talk about so one of the things we mentioned previously is battle damage assessment came up as we were introducing and things like that. I mean, and that's secondary tertiary effects of any form of effect, if you will, be it an actual kinetic weapon versus a cyber attack, always has to be a consideration. And generally is surprisingly more. I think people have a misgiving about being in the military or war that we are in some way, shape, or form this like unhinged group that is blood hungry or whatever else. And realistically, it's just a constant risk assessment that's going through our heads as to what can we do to make sure that this happens versus this happening. And there we are held to a very high standard should any of those secondary or tertiary effects happen. And I mean that both as an independent individual, if you accidentally fire your weapon, I know so many people that lost rank over that. And then if you make a really big mess up, you're kicked out, you can end up in federal prison. It's very easy.
Well, I want to flip one back over to you because you were Mar4 Cyber. You did a lot of threat hunting and things like that. When you look at the distinction between your ability to defend the national objectives of the United States against cyber warfare, but then you look at an entity like a utility plant that wasn't directly under your purview, but you knew could have wartime effects. How did you handle that? How did you handle that inability to have governance or adversary visibility into those networks?
So with those particular networks, they fall under a different sector, obviously, of the government that actually does have work to monitor and everything else like that. There's also other methods and ways of monitoring from different areas, if you will, without going into too many details. But point being is, you know, we were focused on what we can control. And with those secondary and tertiary effects, I mean, I just said it, you do a risk matrix. You try and plan for extra generators if you think you're going to be losing power at any time. You build your building to specific variances to, account for EMI shielding sometimes. Like there's all sorts of different items and objectives. We also had to rely a lot on the intelligence factor, the intelligence reporting from different entities and sources and things like that, which can be difficult because if you don't have context to where they got the information, you can kind of feel in the dark and have a lot of difficulty telling if that behavior pattern was just specific to that instance or that event versus is this just their common, this is just the way they act every time they go in somewhere. So,
Yeah, 100%, 100%.
mhm. Well, with that, so we talked a bit about historically where Russia's at. We've talked about what it's like working in that type of area. Um, you know, do you remember some of Russia's capabilities, like the ones that you specifically would see as because part of one thing I think people might not realize is that part of both of our training has been threat emulation, understanding
Hmm.
the adversary and then acting as them when necessary to, practice, if you will, run a scrimmage. Um, so from the technical capacity, what are some of the things that you remember?
One of the things that I want to make sure that everybody's aware of, and I've spoken freely about this, since I've been allowed to. Um, Russia, as well as other nation states that exist out there that could pose a cyber risk to enterprises today, um, allow their civilian workforce to openly adopt an aggressive cyber militia, if you will. Specifically, there are some nation states out there who encourage and empower their civilian cyber force to go out there and conduct cyber operations for their own financial or information gathering need. I don't want to call it any specific group or any specific country or anything else like that, but there was definitively one group where they would actively exploit companies to basically put in black hole and Eleanor exploit kits back a few years ago. But they had a directive specifically sent down from their government leadership that said if you happen to exploit any DoD contractor, any government organization, anybody of political power, and they had a list of criteria. We want you to stop your cyber crime activity, and we want you to actually put in our nation state malware on there instead. Back away from that target, leave it to us. We'll take it over from there. And that was, I think that may be some of the first times that some of you may have heard just the level of cooperation that exists between the civilian hacking force and the state hacking force in that regard. And so when we look at it from a technical capability perspective, and we saw recently, I think Ukraine last week, several other websites had been attacked with a wiper based malware that was seeking to wipe out a lot of their infrastructure. That wasn't an attack, and I think that that's one of the things that I want to emphasize most is that wasn't an attack that Russia woke up one day and said we're going to target the Ministry of Defense. Boom, we got access to it in one day, and boom, we're going to install the wiper software on there. Those operations are ongoing. When we talk about how a cyber operation works, there are organizations, whether it's United States, insert whatever state sponsored capability out there that seeks to constantly gain access into target networks for the purposes of again intelligence gathering, knowing that those access points could eventually turn into cyber warfare or some other type of effect at some point in time in the future. And so what you saw the results of an ongoing cyber operation that allegedly Russia had continued to do inside of the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense. And then when the time was right, they launched their attack inside the Ministry of Defense to basically wipe all of those computers. And so, to Jack's point earlier, and to the conversation we were having earlier, this is why it's not just about some leet sauce 0 day, or they've got 50 computer guys in a room locked together finding the latest and greatest 0 days that are out there. It's that level of coordination and operational efficiency that makes the state sponsored hackers so deadly. Do they have 0 days at their disposal? Absolutely. Do they have a group of smart folks who are actively out there trying to find, buy, exploit vulnerabilities on a regular basis? Absolutely. But it's that type of operational organization that I think is what makes Russia or any other state sponsored entity, that's that definition of advanced in my opinion.
I would fully agree. I think another issue too that a lot of people don't consider is that it makes attribution much more difficult from a defender's perspective because you have so many different people acting in so many different ways, but still reaching the same objective. So it becomes hard to fingerprint these individuals. And for those of you unaware from what I'm talking about from a detection standpoint, fingerprinting is the capacity to actually tell who the author of malware is or who's running the actual operations and the events. And it can be from looking at the string events of what was used in the command line versus what type of methods that were utilized within the code itself. There's all different methods and ways. I mean, the easiest one would be, you get fingerprinted by just going to, as an individual user, you going to a website, you will be fingerprinted, and you will say, this is you because this is your ad ID, this is your, browser type, this is whatever else that you have going on. Imagine that, but at the technical level for whenever we come and we look at things after the fact, if a CSI, if you will. But because they utilize so many different operators to reach the same objectives, it becomes a laundry list of capabilities and capacities when in reality it's just like that contractor used to work for us.
Well, and quite honestly, when we talk about attribution, that's another part, right? There's
Mhm.
there's a bunch of organizations right now who are potentially going to get attacked as part of some ongoing cyber activity that's going on right now, whether that's net new cyber activity or they're going to bear witness to threat actors who have already had access to their network. You're going to be quick to want to blame it on Russia. You're going to be quick to want to do attribution, and I can't emphasize enough. I'm in the camp to where attribution is useless. I definitely don't subscribe to the belief that if you are working for a private, sector company providing a service or capability, and you get hit with some form of cyber attack, that you need to run out and try to determine whether it was China, whether it was Russia, whether it was, who insert whatever company, country, threat actor group, whatever the case is here. The reason being is that most entities are not and should not be equipped to do any type of hackback or retaliation against them. Even the United States military, when it comes to detecting cyber attacks, I can unequivocally tell you that simply because you don't see it in the news on a day-to-day basis, the United States government, all the entities, whether it's DoD, FBI, CIA, right, DOJ, every entity in the United States government is getting attacked on a daily basis. There are penetrations that are detected and there are penetrations that are undetected. And you don't hear about them because they are handled in the course of normal cyber defensive posture, as Jack mentions. And so, it is because attribution doesn't even do, I don't want to say it doesn't do anything, but it doesn't do much even at the national level other than fuel the flames of political fire. And even more so if you're a private entity, you're not going to do anything about it. And so attribution is probably one of the lowest things that you should be worried about, especially in this ongoing cyber crisis that you may be dealing with now with Russia and Ukraine. You should just be handling it in the course of your normal incident response workflow. Jack?
Absolutely, and that's one of the issues that I was reading previously is, there were multiple attacks against Ukraine that just recently happened within the last week or so, and a couple more that were leading up to it, and it was immediately just assumed it's either Russia, a Russia entity, or some form of Russia likely paid them or engaged with them because at this point, especially with the speed of operations that you need to move at to actually be effective, you're just kind of just assuming, and then you might get to the actual truth someday down the line if somebody really wants to. But the realism is you have to keep operations up and going,
Mm-hmm.
and then you can go back and look at the evidence that will still last and exist. So let me go ahead and hit some of these questions real quick before we keep moving on there, Neil.
Yeah.
So Brian Godfrey asked a really great question. So FSB's takedown of Revel was because they didn't play by Mr. Putin's rules.
I think in the grand scheme of things, we'll never know the actual real reason why the FSB took down Revel. You know, I'm in no better place to hypothesize than I think anybody else is out there. I think that there is anywhere a combination of absolutely they didn't play by Mr. Putin's rules to they needed to have some political stunt to show that they were trying to support the international efforts to try to crack down on cybercrime. There's a wide gamut of stuff. I think that in the essence of that question, nobody will ever know, but that is not a far-fetched theory by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah, I would agree too. Even when I saw it, I was like, I just shook my head because I'm like, half that group is not part of that, and they're gonna pop back up in the next couple of weeks. I mean, that's. I think a lot of cybersecurity professionals saw that type of reporting and were just like, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Um, so JC137 asked about when you talk about ISP, should they have extensive background checks for employees that are in the NOx and ensure that there are not any vulnerabilities to, as you say, social exploitation? So I'm thinking, I think they might be worried about insider threat here as
Yeah.
an extension of, cyber war.
Yeah, I think and I don't know how you feel about insider threat. I'm also very, very cynical on insider threat as well, because I think that it's you know that is one where you could get a lot of accidental collateral damage based on what you suspect is illicit behavior, which is in fact just normal human behavior. And I don't think anybody really understands what normal behavior is versus non-normal behavior when it comes to how they operate on a
Mhm.
network. And so, like, I'm very, very cynical on insider threat. To the root of your question is, should ISPs do background checks? I think that I think you should apply a mentality that if you are operating with sensitive information, or you are operating in critical infrastructure, or you are operating with a high risk business item, I think you should weigh your risk tolerance. And I don't think background checks are so far out of line. Depending on what your risk posture is. Do I think that you should worry about insiders from a cyber perspective? We saw if it was gosh, this is probably a year ago now. Jack, remind me if I keep me honest on this one, where there was a ransomware gang member in Utah. I think it was Utah or Texas or Nevada, wherever the Tesla manufacturing site is, trying
Mhm.
to bribe an employee for, like, I think it was like $1 million or something like that, to give them a USB
Oh,
drive to walk into a Tesla a manufacturing facility and stick it in there from a ransomware perspective. And so I think that's something that you can do a background check all day, but may not necessarily show itself up as being a potential cybersecurity insider threat problem. Do I
mm,
think in the current conflict you should be worried about insider threat? I think that if you are an international company and you have offices all across the globe, I think that insider threat is probably something you had on your radar already. And so I think that you probably are already looking for it. I think that I'll let you chime in from a detection and response perspective when it comes to insider threat.
yeah, realistically, I mean, you should always. I personally, I believe that you should always be cognizant of job duties. Make sure that your separation, basic job duty separation, the basics of maintaining, appropriate access as necessary. I think that if you are regional to the actual current warfare, that is a very fair thing to be cognizant of, a bit more cognizant of. I mean, don't go on a witch hunt, but
Yes, please
I
don't
think,
go on a witch hunt.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
For those of you not unaware of what we're talking about, don't immediately, if you hear hooves, don't immediately think zebras. It could just be a horse. You know what I mean? And
yeah,
that's an old saying that um, when you're doing threat detection and you see somebody that has too many failed login attempts, don't immediately think that they're trying to hack your server, hack your database, and they're, an insider agent, but treat it appropriately through the protocols as to an actual investigation. Just don't jump to conclusions is basically a really complicated way of saying that.
yeah. Agreed. Agreed.
Um, so, we're kind of moving along through this, and there are more than a couple questions here. I'm going to kind of pivot this a little bit into it. Devnil Zen gave us a great question. Do you think companies making very public statements about supporting Ukraine are opening themselves to cyber threats? And I'm going to pivot that into our conversation about what can we do further about
Mhm.
enterprise protection and enterprise defense?
I don't think that if you are making public statements in support of Ukraine that you are any more or any less likely to become a target than you were prior to conflict breaking out. As I said before, there's a term we use, when we talk about cyber warfare, where we talk about operational preparation of the environment, right? OPE.
Mhm.
When you are preparing the environment for any type of cyber attack, that's where you're already hacking into that organization. You've already sent your spear phishing emails. You've already found a 0 day in their boundary. You're already establishing your short haul and your long haul communications, and you're already in there conducting cyber operations to basically prepare that environment for a future, cyber mission that you could have to do. If you weren't a target prior to the conflict, you simply showing support, at least from a state sponsored activity, doesn't instantly make you a target whatsoever. When Jack and I talk about the vigilantism and the hacktivism, and I know that I've seen some questions come through chat about the anonymous stuff, and I know that's something that we can definitely talk about the vigilantism and the hacktivism. You could potentially be seen as a target in that regard, but I think that that really just kind of gets back to what is your profile? What is it you're trying to do? Are you a high value target? If Mom's Pizza Shop is supporting Ukraine, it's probably not likely that they're going to be a target of some type of vigilantism or hacktivism, and unless somebody just wants to make a statement for the cloud on the interwebs. But I think, if to your original question, Dev, I think if you weren't a target before, you simply supporting doesn't instantly escalate you on the target profile.
I would agree. I would say I would argue that if you suddenly became part of the supply chain in any way, shape, or form because new you're opening up new services offerings or expanding everything else like that, you might become might migrate into the
Hmm.
target list, right? Um, but I would also argue that their hands are busy enough that I'm not even sure if they're, unless you cause a really big splash, I don't think that they're probably entertaining
Right.
beyond what they already had planned.
Yeah.
There's a lot of work to be done from their
I I,
perspective.
th- I hate this whole argument. You know this, Jack. We've talked about this extensively. Like, I hate this whole argument where it's like, no, I'm just going to keep quiet because I don't want to become a target
Mhm.
myself. And I don't think that that is an adequate cybersecurity strategy, right? If you're a company out there and you're like, oh, I'm just gonna not gonna say anything and hopefully nobody pays attention to me, that
Mhm.
nowhere in military doctrine, nowhere in NIST publications, nowhere in CISSP, nowhere in anything does it say if you ignore it, you will never become a cyber target.
That's true. And then there's also something to say about not making a target of yourself by calling people out. But again,
Right.
you have to call them out. Like, don't like you can talk about situations, global situations, without necessarily specifically calling somebody directly out and saying we're a challenge. I'm trying very hard not to do it myself as an example.
Right, exactly.
So Palmy asked a great question. I've read a speculation article that said the immediate risk of cyber attacks from Russia to companies and corporations now higher than before, especially for companies and countries that have implemented sanctions. Do you think the industry needs to be on special alert right now? Now, I think we've already covered the sanctions part and whether or not you're high risk. We've you know tapped that one, but the part that I do want to hit on this is should we be on special alert as cybersecurity providers?
I think the answer is unequivocally yes. Absolutely. I think anytime there is certain global issues that we're all dealing with, especially in an area, you know, this one in particular that does center around warfare, I think there is a large section of the populace that should absolutely be on special alert. Obviously, I think this is larger than some of the other global issues that we've seen over the last 5 to 10 years. This is probably one of the more major ones we've seen over the last 5 to 10 years. This one causes for more attention to that special alert than I think some of the others. But I think regardless of where you're at, regardless of what your threat profile is, regardless, I think you should be taking particular, due course in evaluating your risk, evaluating your defensive posture, evaluating the training of the folks that are on your team, providing you with those defensive capabilities, and basically, just taking an inventory and making sure that you're ready should the lasers start getting pointed in your direction.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree as well. One of the things I can tell you right now that is going to happen, I'm going to forecast the future for you. Ready? We are going to see phishing campaigns about Russia and Ukraine. Donate here, donate there.
Absolutely.
It's a fake link. It happens every
Absolutely.
time. Happens with the pandemic. You're going to get users that were like, "Oh, I was trying to donate to whatever," and it's going to be something. So,
Absolutely.
I mean, whenever you have any of these big events, you can always anticipate that stuff happening. So I know that one's coming. Um, should you be worried beyond what we talked about in the target listing if you're part of the supply chain or your whatever else? Should you be worried about Russian APTs targeting your company?
No, I do not
With an
think,
asterisk.
with an asterisk, right? I think as a general rule, I think 90% of the companies out there do not have Russian APT on their bingo card. I don't think they have a
I'd agree.
reason to.
I'd agree with that.
Yeah.
Um, I do think that there is always a cognizant view to have if you're in any form part of the country's infrastructure.
Yeah.
But that's just more so regular infrastructure concerns, things like that. Now, if the work isn't done yet, do you think that what are some things that individual enterprises can start doing to either bolster up detection or bolster up, preparation, if you will?
Um, I think familiarizing yourself with, MITRE ATT&CK and Russian APT groups is a fantastic place to start. One of the super simple things, and I know it's hard to do for a lot of organizations, but if you're an organization that you definitively know that you only have US based clients or you only have clients of your specific particular country, your your executives don't travel to, conflict countries or countries that are, potentially, high threat from an APT perspective, you can start locking things down on a per country basis, right? If you don't have to have traffic originating from a high threat country, then what's stopping you from shutting down access to that traffic from those high threat countries? Now, again, this doesn't, there's always going to be somebody out there who's like, oh, but VPN this and oh, but Tor network that. And sure, but that's why we go back to the training, which is defense in depth, right? And how do we build defensive postures in depth? And so if you can at least stop, traffic origination from high threat countries, then that is at least one less threat vector that you have to worry about in terms of that. And again, I know that that's always it's always a touchy subject because people say, well, I can't limit traffic here, or I've got clients here, or I've got travel that happens there, and that's fine. You take it what you can. You know, we so undervalue we so undervalue getting back to the basics. Having patches on your system, having multi-factor authentication put in place, having strong detection and response rules, having a well-rehearsed tabletop incident response plan, are all things that I think are super easy for most organizations to do on a day-to-day basis. Now's a fantastic time to dust those things back off and make sure they're all working for you.
I would agree with that. And I'm going to actually go a step further. And right, if you want to do something as a leader right now, I would highly suggest you audit your administrators list. Take a look at all the administrators in your enterprise environment, and you should be able to identify who they are in the organization immediately. At least the non-service accounts, I should say. Um, it's one of those things where I people keep saying, I keep saying over and over again, back to the basics.
Yeah.
And the basics are what do you have, who is in charge of it, and who you're talking to. Those three things. If you can say those three things, then you're going to be ahead of the curve.
When we
You know?
talk about like all the phishing emails that you're going to get coming out of this Russia Ukraine thing, don't forget all the vendor emails that are going to come out and tell you that they've got all the greatest technology that's going to help you be protected from any type of APT from Russia Ukraine. So
Mhm.
there is no substitute for the basics.
I fully agree. DJ Bisek asked, should we just call Jack Bauer? Um, you know, I'm not so sure that Kinetic would be really helpful right now there, Bisek, but appreciate the question all the same. I will say that from a defensive perspective, if you are seriously interested in doing threat hunts related to this or any other forms of this, one thing you can take a look at is DNS site requests based on reputation. If there are external entities that are going from, take a look at people that are connecting to Twitter via browser basis. Usually that's something that you handle from an app on your phone. If you're connecting via Twitter and you see something that's happening very frequently and they're not in marketing, you might want to just take a look and be like, yo, why is the CFO's computer constantly connected to Twitter? Um, that's part of
Yeah.
man control domains. And then I used to like to take PowerShell back. We would log all the PowerShell scripts and stuff. I would stack them and then I'd do a diff on them with a count. And then I would see the ones that only were ran once or twice. And I would comb through those sometimes and see like, what are the really long ones by count, like lengthwise, and poke around for some of that stuff. Usually it was just a waste of time, but on occasion you get lucky.
Absolutely. Absolutely. PowerShell is still unlogged and allowed on most networks. So
Yeah,
100%.
absolutely. Um, well, a lot of the blogs, and I was taking a look at wow, I just completely forgot what the reference was that we were talking about on Friday. Well, the CISA put it out.
Oh,
Anyway,
the notice or the recommendation?
both. I can't remember what it's called though. It's the acronym. Anyway, enough of me floundering on here. Point being is, CISA put out a notification on, I believe it was Friday, but some of the recommendations on there was, one of them was turn logging on. And while I agree and disagree, I also disagree with that too, because if you just turn logging on and you're not aware of any form of logging strategy, those can actually cause hits to your operational capacity if they fill up and you have no way of rolling them or anything.
Yeah, the just turn logging on, I think I it's it's hard to that's one of those where it's like your intentions are good, Sissa. I
Mhm.
appreciate what your intentions are good at. Um, what they mean is if you're not logging, you should be logging. That is a true statement. You should be logging.
Very much so.
If you haven't logged anything up until now, you simply turning logging on isn't going to do anything for what may have happened in the past. It may allow you to catch something that may happen tomorrow.
Mhm.
If, to Jack's point, you've done all of the other things that kind of go along with logging, which is developed your use cases, identified your indicators of compromise, put them into your alerting platform, and giving you actually something actionable to look at on your defensive radar instead of just turning on logging and figuring out how to go from there, Jack.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I think it just depends also. I mean, let's be honest, cybersecurity is definitely not one size fits all. It is very much so a custom measure based on what your company is doing. Um, Depending on your size, yeah, the basics will go a very long way, and you can usually find some off the shelf solutions that will work for most 80% of what you need, right? But
Yeah,
when the larger you get, the more of a custom solution that you're going to need. It's just
yeah,
kind of like a suit for whenever you're working in the job too. The higher you get up in the company, the more custom that suit should probably look.
yeah. I don't want to bash on CISA too hard. Their intentions are good, but there's a lot more to
Mhm.
that statement than I think they realized when they put it out.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think you made some good points too, talking about the higher end echelons of this. You talked about doing the dry run. So yeah, brush off your disaster recovery plan.
Mhm.
Do a dry run real quick. Talk to everybody that is involved as far as the stakeholder. Make sure they know it, they understand it. Maybe sit down for an hour and be like, "Yo, if this happens, what do we do then?"
Yeah,
Just a quick like Q&A session, and judge whether or not they're ready. If not, then maybe have them focus a little bit more on time. Another thing is check your backup schedules. I think that
yeah,
would probably be more effective than turn on logging.
yeah, yeah, for sure. Especially in the age of ransomware, way
Hmm.
more important.
Absolutely, absolutely. Um, we had a lot of questions this time about, and we've seen, and I'm not sure if we want to talk about this or dive too deep into this, but we've seen a bit on hacktivism, you
Yeah.
know, we've seen a bit on vigilantism that's going on with this. Anonymous has taken some actions recently. I'm not sure if you want to make a comment on that at all.
Um. So probably about 18 months ago, I had General Williams on my show, and General
Mhm.
Williams was the 3-star general in charge of U.S. Cyber Command when I was there, and we had a very heated and in depth conversation about this. And I think he said it best, right? Is um, you know you should let the professionals do what the professionals do, right? I don't. And again, I want to make something expressly clear. I do think the United States needs to adopt some of the same encryption type services that other nation states do in terms of allowing allowing their folks to join some type of formalized cyber militia, outside of what the government, allows them to do. So I'm definitely on the side of that. But I think that a general call for cyber vigilantism and cyber hacktivism could end up causing more problems than I think that most organizations or even most people want to admit. I mean, certainly it is very cool to do the call to arms and go wage cyber war from across the globe to try to help, try to help a country out that's in disarray. And I absolutely wholeheartedly empathize with those people who want to do that. But when we talk about strategy to task, I want everybody to understand you could definitively be interrupting at some level established cyber missions that some nation state, some allied nation state to Ukraine is doing out there right now. And that may not necessarily be the effect that you wanted to have. You maybe think, oh, I'm just going to DDoS this website. But what if that website was providing some critical piece of access to some key internal infrastructure inside the target nation? And you DDoSing that, that news site basically cuts off any allied ability to conduct further cyber operations that may be stopping a missile attack, stopping communication flow to forward battlefield commanders. And those are things that, because you're not privy to by doing cyber vigilantism and hacktivism, things like that, you could be doing more harm than good. And so it's exciting. It's 100% exciting. And I empathize with everybody who wants to participate. And rarely, and by rarely, I mean never, have we ever had a global call to arms, number one, let alone a global call to arms for everybody to help from a cyber perspective. But again, I would caution everybody that saw that call to arms to be cautious about engaging in it, because you may actually be having a negative effect when you think you're having a positive effect. Additionally, I want to caution everybody who's reading the reports of some of the hacktivism that's going on out there. DDoSing a website, hacking into somebody's WordPress site, things like this. There is a concept that we have in the military. We got the 5 Ds, right? I'm going to mess this up. I know I am. Deny, degrade, disrupt, destroy, or deceive. Look there, I got all 5 of them right that time. Those are the general rules that most strategy to task is built on to, is how do we deny, degrade, deceive, disrupt, destroy, any of the adversary's capabilities when we go to conduct a military operation. Simply because you DDoSed RT, for instance, just because that was in the news, you have no idea what the impact of DDoSing RT was, right? RT is Russian telecom, I think it is, for Russian TV. Did you actually do anything? Is it up and running now? Did you stop some critical address? There is a difference between DDoSing it because it's fun right now versus when there is a potential address that is about to happen from a political leader, and then you DDoSing it at that point in time versus randomly over time. And so it's that mentality and that construct that I think gets lost in this excitement around hacktivism and this excitement around vigilantism that I think makes the effort, quite frankly, kind of moot and useless, in my opinion.
I would fully agree. And I think that, there's a bit of almost FOMO of fear of missing out for some of the individuals that are within the community. You know what I mean? Like you're right. This was a call to arms for a global call to arms. But I think at this point, it's not always that all hands make the best effort, right? Sometimes it needs to be tailored or, structured or whatever else. You can have everybody you want there to help build a house, but if they can't swing a hammer correctly, then it's just going to be a complete mess, and there's going to be more people in the way, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
And again,
I mean,
I'm not trying to poo-poo on this idea. Like, look, when it happens, Lord knows I get excited. I'm like, woo, we get to do some cyber militiaing. But at the same time, I know what it's like to be in those war rooms and those battle conversations. And the less external influence you have while you're trying to conduct a cyber operation, the more successful it's likely to be.
that's one. And also, Jess Bishop makes a great point in chat there. There are also potential legal consequences to face as well. That just because there's been a call out doesn't mean it came from any, I have not heard or seen an official for the US, at least DOJ, stance on that.
That's right.
So
I mean, we're not lawyers here on this call, but the Computer Fraud and
mhm.
Abuse Act doesn't say that if Ukraine calls you up and says, "Hey, we'd love for you to hack," on behalf of us, that you're not going to get a knock on the door from somebody around that.
Exactly, and you would be surprised, like, and there's a whole other there's a whole other conversation to have too about anonymity and the use of a basic technology. I promise you, you start sending packets from Cali out through your basic ISP and trying to hit something on the far side of the web that you haven't VPN'd into, you're going to get a call from your ISP. They're going to shut you down too. They see that stuff. So,
A lot to be
absolutely.
considered there. A lot more to be considered there.
Very, very much so, and something that I think we can dive into all absolute day. I think that's going to be about it for the questions. Neal, thank you so much for joining us today. As always, it's always a great time with you. I really do enjoy the time and value added. So thank you so much for it. I'm going to sign off with the group.
Thanks for hosting, and thanks to everybody in the audience for participating today. And I look forward to chatting with you again soon.
Sounds good. See you then, Neal. All right. Well, everybody, that wraps up today's stream. Thank you so much for watching. Now, if you're just tuning in and you happen to miss it live, or there are some points early on that we were talking about that you didn't quite get, that's fine. Take a look for the replay across all of our social channels and on the INE website. We will be live again tomorrow, Tuesday, March 1st, for a special segment discussing Women's History Month with our own Catherine Brown and Natasha Emanuel. They will be diving into historic and present day women pioneers within the STEM fields, along with Alexandria San Miguel as our special guest. I swear, people, I can't speak appropriately, just not today. Be sure to like and subscribe on our social platform you're using so you can stay in the loop for details on the next stream and also the notifications when we do go live with our special guests. As always, bring your questions and say hi. We really do enjoy and engage with you guys here. Thank you so much for today. Thank you so much for the questions. A lot of really stimulating conversation. I'm really glad that we were able to be there with you today, and hopefully we were value added. So we will see you next time. And until then, have a great week and be safe. Or a great week, sorry.